So here we are coming back together. And as I was saying, I'm very grateful to see you all. And in thinking about just to review, what are we up to? Because it's great to come together and have a conversation, but there's always something really special about what happens in our field together. Because I think we do come in with this kind of meta intention, which is to enter into a different kind of conversation than we ordinarily have. And again, way back when Lonny and I first talked about this possibility of intentionally creating a space for intersubjective dialogue among us as practitioners of Chinese medicine, not so much to just, as you know, we are all really good at doing, bringing in concepts or expounding on ideas or bringing in the wisdom of the past, but rather trying to experience in real time a kind of presencing that, at least for me, is actually at the heart of the medicine, which is a non-dual, atemporal, even non-linear kind of presencing to the world. And we're calling it an intersubjective dialogue. It's one name. You could call it integral dialogue. We could call it a kind of awareness meditation together. But I do like calling it intersubjective dialogue and really pointing to the intentionality of opening to a different kind of consciousness through being together. So the kind of being together that we look at and we've been looking at, and I think we keep getting better and better at, is not the kind of dialogue where we're talking about ideas or theories or even our own experience, our clinical experiences as practitioners, but rather opening together to a kind of almost group meditation space, which really is the space of healing that when we're really on our game in the treatment room, this is what's happening. But now to bring it into group space. And this kind of presencing where we allow the multiplicity of our perspectives to be present, to intermingle, but to keep the focus on what's arising in the field of our togetherness. For me, and I think that when I say I'm so grateful to be together, it's as if this opens a kind of an escape hatch from the stranglehold of binary mental consciousness. That at this point, I'm holding as the most virulent pathogenic factor on the planet, which is this degenerating rationality and dualism. So right now, right here, we can invite something different to happen. And through this process together, open to something that we don't even know what's going to come. So the thing I wanted to share about tonight is something I've really been thinking about, because we can't make the experience of a shift in consciousness happen. I mean, we can make it happen by intentionally using plant medicine or certain kinds of meditation processes. But when we come together for an hour and a half, we can't say, okay, now we're moving into this different consciousness. We're leaving mental behind. We're moving into non-dual. We don't know when that magic happens. And I think we've seen that. Like we'll be here, we're talking, and then all of a sudden, there's that spaciousness. So something happens. And I've been thinking about, so since we can't make it happen, but we can create the conditions for it, and we're learning what those conditions are. And certainly we can learn, we can get clues from the sages of the past in our, Taoist lineage. But if we really are going to say, okay, what are the conditions? So we're seeing the willingness to sit together in silence, bearing those pauses where we don't know. We don't know what we're going to say. We don't know what's going to happen, but feeling safe enough to be in that space together, in silence, in not knowing, in deep listening to what's arising. So these are clearly skills that, we're developing. But the thing that's come to me is it's also very clearly a kind of three-part awareness process that we're doing here. So what I'm seeing is, in order for this kind of magical conduit to open out of the mental and into a multidimensional being together, we need to be paying attention to what is happening inside our bodies, kind of an internal presencing to the somatic arisings, to my own internal mood states, the images and whatever's happening in there, the somatic responses. We need to be presencing to the group and the field, so a kind of interactive awareness. And then there's this transpersonal presencing. So it's like there's an internal and a field, and then a transcendent. And those three kinds of, the capacity for those three awarenesses seems to me prerequisite for what we're up to. And also for I would say, optimizing the practice of Chinese medicine, so they're not separate. So when I wanted to speak to that, because I've been really sitting with what are we actually doing? And what have we cultivated in ourselves to be able to do it? So that three-part focus, holding them simultaneously. And for those who are gracing us with your time and listening, whether even to the recording, I really would invite everyone to listen from those three levels of awareness as well. And from the dimension we're in here, doesn't matter whether you're here or listening later or listening at some other time in this atemporal dimension, we are actually initiating or erupting a different way of being aware, which, as I said before, to me feels like the greatest medicine of our time. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Alexander, so we know what we're actually going to be talking about.
Yeah, thank you, Lorie. Yeah, so the idea is that we cultivate this quality of listening and exploring together, and then we drop a topic into that. And so it's a way for us to explore different ways of dialoguing in relationship. And what we're going to explore tonight is what's the role of the absolute and the relative um, in the treatment room, maybe in life, in relationship. And so what I'd like to do is just briefly define some loose contours of what that could mean. I don't want to define anything too much because we're going to explore it together. But we can say that the absolute dimension of being, um, it's timeless, it's boundless. That means it's prior to space and time. It doesn't have a location. You can't go find it. and nothing's ever happened here. It's completely whole, but not whole like the apple is whole, because that's already in time and in space. So it's one of those things that it's very difficult to talk about, because as soon as you talk about it, you're taking a perspective from the relative. But it is possible to inhabit it, to um, to be it, where there's no longer a meditator. There's no longer a meditator that's meditating on the absolute. There's just the absolute with no looker, awakening to itself. Then we have the relative, which is everything else. If we're going to put in a false dualism here as a start. So there's everything else, all the birds and the chickens and the perspectives and um, boats and acupuncture needles and problems and tragedy and relationship to overcoming tragedy or taking a new perspective on tragedy. So we have the relative, which is this dimension of great proliferation. There's the ecology of existence, the interdependency of um, the myriad, the 10,000 things and how they wiggle together. And so we have this question of what's the role that the absolute and the relative play in the treatment room? What is the role? What is the relationship between the absolute and the relative? How do we understand these territories of being? And that's what we're going to do. So with that, we can dive into this territory, see what's there.
When Lorie was bringing up what we do here and the three different aspects of it, the internal, what is the embodied experience of this, and then the transcendent aspect, and then the interrelational field that we work within. And then, Alexander, when you brought up the topic of the absolute and the relative, I thought, okay, we've got the transcendent here as the absolute. We've got the relative as our being here. And then there's this third dimension, like what is it that bridges the experience of the absolute as the relative, so that it kind of collapses the duality like we do here. Like when we open up, it does not feel like there's three things going on. It feels like there's one thing going on.
Oh, I love that, Randy. That is so potent for me because, you know, when Lonnie sort of pitched the topic, how about the absolute and the relative? And I was like, I mean, how do we make that actually a lived experience in a grant, how does that actually inform my work with someone in the treatment room? And of course, I mean, what I feel like you're bringing forward so beautifully there is we think absolute relative, but it's actually the third, that field dynamic that happens in relationship, which I think of as the soul in a certain sense, that subtle body, that whether it's, Wu Shen or however we talk about it, that access from the absolute big Shen and, the depths of my uh, instinctual nature and all the mess that it gets me into, that relative world. And then, like, it's the go between. And actually, that's really, for me, a beautiful piece to sit with.
Yeah, that's where it feels like the living happens, where the magic happens, where it's neither absolute nor relative, but is both of those things. In this moment, in this interaction, there's something that could never happen otherwise unless we were here doing this right now. And that, I think, is the unnameable, because we have lots of ways of defining the absolute and the transcendent. But it's that indefinable, interactive, intimate piece that defies description because it's too alive.
It occurs to me too that there's something about interacting with our client's pain and holding this sort of these two dimensions, that the client's pain is part of the relative experience, just like all of our pain is part of the relative experience. But somehow when I'm able to make contact with that in myself and in the people that I'm with as an extension of the absolute, there's a way that there's an instantaneous freedom from the gripping of it, but at the same time, a deep honoring of it as a relative expression. And I have a sense that there's something about that balance that's really important in the treatment room, because if I just transcend over my client's pain, like, oh, you know, nothing really has ever happened. No one, I mean, that just doesn't feel good when you're in agony. But if we get too far into the pain itself, there's a kind of loss of freedom. There's kind of a getting caught in the jungle of hell. And somehow there's this fine balance that seems to be like liberating and simultaneously honoring of where the person is experiencing themselves and their world.
Yeah, what arises from me listening is one way we can frame it is, the absolute dimension, as being the already enlightened self, Buddha nature, or Xing as the Chinese would call it, the true nature of the self prior to the primordial self. And we could look at that as the absolute, and then we could look at the relative as all the ego and superego machinations and psychology and soul, relative psychological and soul level issues around it. And as Alexander says, I mean, what you were intimating, but if we just look at that absolute dimension, we can bypass all the complexity in a way that isn't healthy, and then the important work isn't done. And if we spend too much time going into the relative dimension and focusing, we can actually just reinforce identification with it. But another way to frame it really is that we know that being and becoming, emptiness and luminosity, heaven and earth, yin and yang, are one. And another way to look at it is like absolutely what is true here is there is an already enlightened, already free dimension of the self. And there, which is simplicity, and there is all this complexity, and this is their relationship at this moment. And this is the dynamic between me, the patient, and all of that in this moment, that the absolute is just what is, embracing all of it. And for me, that really has softened the whole thing. I mean, there's a striving toward the balance between truth and compassion. And what's interesting to me is just the dynamic of right here, right now, what's in the picture, and can I embrace all of it, and can I help the patient embrace all of that as absolutely what is, rather than just creating an artificial division that the absolute is Buddha nature and is fine, and the relative is necessarily suffering and pain. Because I mean, there's an awful lot of good stuff out here in the relative world. I mean, I really like bagels and lox, for instance. That's relative. I mean, there's a lot to like out in the relative world. So I just think there's something about the real medicine being able to embrace with and sit with things as they are, and hopefully have the patient be able to see the whole thing, to see the whole picture, to step back and just sort of embrace the dynamic as it is. To me, there's something like absolute about that, even though it includes the relative and doesn't make an enemy of it. Or
I find that sometimes in the treatment room, the relative allows for a certain movement, because you're helping some balance and harmony be established, and my connection with the absolute suddenly flows through me, allowing for me to contact what is the absolute that may mean something to the patient, and flow in that direction. I'm not sure if I'm making sense again. It's almost like taking care of some of the noise and clearing it in some ways, or allowing flow in the patient, somehow allows me also in my grounded state to ask the real question, or the thing that's really at the heart of the matter, and bring it into the equation into the reality, transcending that experience. Does that make sense or not? When I take care of the flow, I'm more conscious of the absolute within me and in me and in the patient, and can give a light to it. It might not be about what they think it's all about, and I might not even know what it's about, but suddenly I can address it, and I don't know where that came from, and it's what needed to be addressed, or brought to light, or have something done about it, or not done about it, but it then starts flowing in the treatment room in a more obvious way. Maybe like one paints a painting, and it's not that painting, but it's something else that needs to be painted over it. I better stop giving these strange analogies. But I think we all know what we're talking about.
I'm thinking about it in terms of like whatever the patient or client's issue is, pain or suffering. And if we're trying to change that, then we're not able to access that flow because we have an agenda on top of it that's part of the relative that doesn't really invite the absolute into that space. But if we absolutely accept their pain, their suffering, their whatever, as being exactly what it's supposed to be for them in this moment, that the absolute rushes in. And in that acceptance, there's a shift, there's a change.
I think you said it better than I did, because that's what I feel I experience, that something rushes in, and I'm taken by surprise, and it's what was. And to me, it feels like it came after the addressing of what was apparently the problem, but not really, maybe. I don't know. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, there's something, I mean, it's absolute to address what is as it is without making a problem out of it. And so sometimes, I mean, in my experience, in times of confusion or great pain or feeling like in a depth I'm going through very deep waters, it's being able to sit in that without making a problem out of any of it, to just let it work through me and to just be with it and learn what and work with it in a way that it isn't a problem, but to let it teach me. And I think that, I mean, to me, that's working, not making a problem out of it and being interested in it and knowing that the real medicine is working with things as they are in the context of nope, in the context of this is what I'm here to do. This is the absolute perfect thing that I need to be with. And to me, that's a joining of the absolute with the relative in a way that there's an alchemy, an alchemy between the two. Because from the perspective of the tradition, at least from the perspective of the way I think of it, the point is not to resolve everything in the relative so the absolute can just be sunshine and divine and exist on its own. The point is transformation in the world. And that happens through this alchemy. I mean, from that perspective, heaven would just be a boring place.
As I'm as I'm listening, what comes up for me is sort of there's like two different directions that we can kind of come at this one thing that's the absolute and the relative. Sometimes it seems like when we work with our clients in the relative realm and support them in embracing what is, as was being mentioned, it can open a doorway into something bigger, something um, vast. And then, of course, there's the other that's sort of like touching into the relative as a and detangling certain things as a way to fall into the absolute. You have some parts of the self that are all pent up and confused and in conflict. You help that soften, and then all of a sudden the person relaxes into something bigger. But then there's the other side of it where it's sort of like the cutting through, where there's cutting through to the non-local already awakened dimension of being and cutting through to that first. And then from there, uh, being what doesn't move. And then the relative starts to the relative is seen from there and then responds uh, accordingly. So it's kind of like I'm hearing sort of these there's like two, because we're only dealing with one thing, you can kind of touch on, but there's sort of two different kind of ways that I hear is coming up in our conversation of how we can lean into this and with our patients.
When I lean into this topic, the two things that I just heard come to mind as Lorie started the conversation with a word that we all have our Taoist roots, and then I think Alexander mentioned the word experience. In a certain way, I think we all drawn to this profession because we want to have this experience that kind of explodes us out of our own limited reality, and then share that once we have a glimpse of that with our patient. One of the things that kind of floated by my inner mind as I was listening here is the character Chu. Forgive me if I'm talking about Chinese characters here, but it's for me it's the characters, and the classical text is not a mental thing. I have a distinctly emotional connection to that. I even dream in characters and dream about certain text passages. And I remember the looking at the point large intestine 11, which is called Xu Chi, which means, I know, the crooked pond, or it's how it's translated, but the word Xu is defined as being but one aspect of the Tao, right? So you have the absolute, that's the Tao, and then you've got the crookedness of the world, which is also goes, that word can also, because that word means bend, but it can also mean the suffering that comes from being limited to that space and being trapped in this teeny little pond. And then the experience that we having when we travel, or when we fall in love, or when we meditate, or whatever makes our experiences, is that this little pond becomes exploded, and we see that the world is so much bigger. Conundrum for me is just always seeing how sometimes so easy to share that space, and immediately, like Lorie was saying at the very beginning, some portal opens, something happens, and you feel it immediately. You feel it here. And sometimes it's just nothing is happening, and it's just small talk. And then at the end of the day, seeing patients, you're tired. Whereas if you in that other space, feel like you just practice qigong all day long. And but there's no real way of, sure, you can have certain practices and jump around between patients or whatever we do, but there is some of it is just happens. We don't know why, and sometimes it's just closed, and we don't know why, and then we feel almost, that word "chi" also can mean criminal, by the way, so it's a little, like we are being trapped in that small world, is in a certain way also the very Christian word sin, in a certain way, goes with that. And as Lonny was saying, the material world and all of its intricacies is beautiful, and the listening to the patient involves staying with the story, but then to kind of transform that story to this feeling of timelessness that is what we all waiting for, I think. And sometimes you can just it's we, you just can't make it happen. It just happens all on its own.
That's interesting with timelessness because my experience is often that whatever happens prior to the insertion of needles, most of the time, once I put a needle in and then left the room and come back in, the patient is experiencing timelessness. They don't know. I open the door. They don't know where they are, what I'm doing in their bedroom, how long they've been there, whether needles are in or out. There is some place they've gone. There is something that happens in almost every treatment which evokes that timelessness.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm, of course, as you know, I mostly work with herbs, so I'm sitting in the front room or so, and I recently changed my clinic procedures where I'm asking all of my patients to, once you're done with here, before you leave, I want you to leave in a different space and send people on to get the acupuncture while they wait for the herbs to be dispensed for precisely that reason that you mentioning there, because that's the beauty of the acupuncture, and I think also maybe a good massage or so that is more of an energetic treatment or so that you can, even without words, or it just can open up in an instant this different dimension there and give the person the client a full body experience of that. Yeah. And instead of having us transmit that, it's the patient can transmit it back to us. And yeah.
When a patient gets lost in complexity, I'll often just listen and listen till they're done talking. And then I'll say, okay, is there anything else in your experience? And very often people will say, oh yeah, and I did this just yesterday. I see patients one day a month, and I did this with a patient, and they said, oh, you mean like something positive? And I said, yeah. And then they just immediately on their own switched into an entire different, and they were like, oh yeah, this is happening. And then it becomes clear, like we have choices about where we put our attention. And a lot of people, most people who aren't in acute crisis can actually shift their attention onto other dimensions of the self. Sometimes I'll say, what does everything you said prior to this moment look like from the perspective of this place you just shifted into? And then that can be very fruitful.
Sometimes even when they're lost in the pain or the suffering or the crisis, that it can happen right there too without shifting out of it, just by not resisting it, like bringing the absolute into the immediacy of the experience that they're having. And I love that. It's like heaven doesn't abhor lack of free flow. It's, it, the absolute isn't saying there shouldn't be suffering, there shouldn't be pain, there shouldn't be the crooked bend. That it's the relative that's is screaming to get out of the relative.
That's very good.
And in the middle, in the midst of the relative is the absolute. So not the absolute and the relative, but the absolute as the relative.
And the relative as the language of the absolute, because the absolute wants to manifest itself in something concrete, but then the limited thing that we make out of it is that we think that's all there is, instead of going like, oh, it's like one thing that then disappears and pops up somewhere else and shows us the multiplicity of possibilities. Yeah. Does that ever happen to you, that sometimes you, from one second to another, you sit on a bus or something and all of a sudden it's almost like you're shocked and you go like, why am I born into this German body and I'm here living in the 21st century? I could be completely different place and different person. And you just think it's like super weird that, it's,
Yeah.
uh, uh,
Alexander and I have talked about it. You're just driving down the road thinking how weird to be consciousness. Like, where am I going? What am I doing?
I'm really taken with the bending idea. And I love, Heiner, how you spoke about Crooked Pond. It was a beautiful bringing forth of the spirit of that point. But as you were speaking, and this idea of that this small pond can be almost like crooked. It's crooked in the sense of criminal, and that struck me that we use the word the same way in English sometimes. But I was also, I don't know, in this conversation about that there really is no difference. Like you said, Alexander, it's a false binary, that the absolute and the relative are not separate. What I got, Heiner, when you were speaking, I had this image of where the prism that bends the light of the absolute so we can see it in a sense in the relative. We so that light of the absolute bends as it comes into matter. It's bent by that. But it's not in fact separate. And then I was thinking, okay, so if the absolute bends to enter into the world of form or visibility, then we can actually back out of it in the same way, as we've been saying, by taking that moment to go, how amazing is this, that there's a computer here, or I have a candle in front. How wildly improbable is it? And bend back through that prism right out into the absolute. So that was I really appreciated you bringing that word in. I think it's that the bending is almost like, Randine, that third thing that you spoke of at the beginning, the intermediary, in a sense, between the domains, a kind of prismatic bending of the light. I guess my question is, if we get even more granular, I mean, as you said, Heiner, we never know. You can't predict when that amazing kind of opening is going to happen, or when we find our way back through the prism into that space of heart opening. But are there actual ways or conditions that facilitate that? I mean, I think when we're talking about a clinical experience, what do we do to facilitate that movement back and forth through the prism?
Well, it's interesting because I mean, my experience is I hear people saying things, and I hear like the idea of bending, but so like there's an outside, which is the discussion, but on the inside, I don't feel anything bent. I mean, in other words, I experience the presence of the absolute as just an infinite field that doesn't recognize any separation from a certain perspective. Like there's just a lot of space. And so I'm aware of like the outside and the facial gestures and movements and words being said, and I can think about it. But at some point, and I don't think this reflects on what you were saying, Lorie, but at some point I just heard words and then feeling just like luminosity and spaciousness as a presence of the absolute that sort of contains all of it. And then expanding and expanding into that.
It reminds me of a practice called lion's gaze. And the idea is when you throw a dog a bone, the dog goes after the bone. But when you throw a lion a bone, the lion looks at you. And it's like this idea of, again, this notion of cutting through is like all these things are moving, the dog bones are being thrown, but you're looking at the groundless ground without a looker. There's a kind of a non-local cutting through. Like when you're in a plane, the sky is already through the clouds and through the plane, right? Like you can look at the plane. It's not like the sky is moving through the plane. The sky is already through the plane. It's always been that way. The sky is always through the clouds. The sky is through us right now. So that's what it's like for me in this moment and in the treatment room. Looking directly at that ground without a looker. There's not a meditator looking at it. It's like the knowing presence of awareness itself. The knowing isn't coming out of eyes. The knowing is omnipresent. And there's a shift from identifying as the structure of light that thinks it's like gazing at things into the knowing presence that is through all things. And then that's like the ground from which the language is arising and the client is arising and the pain is arising and the pain is being liberated as that, in the same way the sky is through the clouds. So it's funny because you can say cutting through, but you're not. It's already through. There's like my experience is there's kind of a orienting to the thing to that which is already through. And sometimes when I'm in a lot of pain, it feels like there's a need for like a little bit of agency to like remember that that's a possibility, but that agency is still in the relative. So it's this kind of thing, a remembering and then a falling into.
Well, it called to mind, I don't know who said this, but when you stare into the abyss long enough, the abyss begins to stare back. And in what you were saying, Alexander, it just seems in that place anything is possible. Things aren't any more determined by circumstances. It seems like in a way the problem of it all is undone, and then I feel in that space like free will arise, like, okay, what is the future that I want to create, and how do I be, and just the imperative to be that now without a sense of limitation. Like all of a sudden, all the things I thought I had to work out, or all the knots I had to untie, they're just not in the way. In other words, there's some aspect of the healing, of the rectification that doesn't take time and is present just absolutely in the heart of that moment.
It's I'm really this sometimes happens for me when we get into these conversations where I'm listening. I mean, like you, Lonny, kind of like listening, present to it. And then at the same time, a part of me is like, okay, how does this play out for me when I'm with a patient? And I will say that the way I would speak to my body felt sense in the treatment room is is quite different from when I listen, so it's interesting to me. I don't know what that is, but like Alexandra, I loved what you're saying about, yes, the sky's already in the plane. And I'm understanding that as, yes, our patients come or a session happens and it's like all this suffering is delivered. I mean, not always. Sometimes people are bringing their, celebrations or joys, but often it's that they bring a suffering to the room, or they bring an impasse, or like I call it, a chunk of lead, something that this needs working through. And I don't experience it. I mean, I don't come in with the same kind of sense of it not consciously. I'm really trying to sit with, how does that live for me? I mean, for me, I feel like what happens there, or even here, is I do go into a kind of a free floating reverie state as the words are coming, or the problems being unfolded, or what's happening there. But then it's like something kind of just, so I'm listening in that way. I'm trying to sense into, is that kind of a listening from the absolute, maybe there's a layer of that, or almost like, oh, I think I can put it this way, because I've been trying to like really bring this into what's the real lived experience for me. As in my body, I feel like it's not quite. And I think what I've come to is this sense that I'm leaning back, and I will often say that to students or people. It's like I can lean back into the Tao. And that I can feel that as what you're talking about. I've been trying to feel it. How does that feel? So for me, I think, yes, it's like I can lean back into the Tao and feel that as a background to everything. Okay. As I am very, very attentively present to the story, to the emotions, to the myth being told to me. And I think when this moment that we're speaking to, when the like Heiner, you said, when that moment happens where the heart has opened or you've entered into the Tao itself, and that is what's operative in the room. Those are the moments, as you said, where there is no fatigue, there's no effort, because we're no longer doing it. The absolute and the relative have truly come together. I mean, again, I'm really listening for like, how do we actually do this? Or create the conditions for it. Yeah. And I think for me, it is that, like this sense that, my whole governing vessel is in the hands of the Tao. Like my will is in the hands of the Tao. And then I'm doing my thing here, picking up the needles, listening to the story, feeling the deep compassion and the suffering, and looking for the amplification of mythology or the elements or the spirits that can bring meaning to the soul story. So, yeah.
I feel like sometimes it's a combination of, it's not just me, it's the patient also. And somehow there is suddenly an ability to hear the soundless sound and know that which is not necessarily cultivated in language, and understand it and just start acting on it. But it's not just me that's the person that's transmitting that. It's in concert with that person. That's why maybe it doesn't always happen with every patient at every time, but it arises because it is always present, but it suddenly becomes accessible, that knowing the unknowable, or like I said, the sort of soundlessness of it is suddenly you just know you can act. But it's an arising that's, even though it's not restricted to time and space, at a certain point it arises, and it's not just something that's just coming through me. The patient is obviously part of the whole story too. And some patients it's easier, more accessible at more times, and other people, you might treat them for months and suddenly something happens and you know that that's really the reason why they're here. And then the following week, it just goes back to the other story, but the crucial thing has happened, and it's just arisen in the greater space and time of not just the treatment room, but the outer context of the outer realities invade, in concert with the absolute at that moment.
Yeah, I mean, what came up for me when you said that, Vasanthi, was my memory of many instances through my career where patients would be coming in and sort of just maintaining the status quo, coming for whatever reason, having experiences. And then they would come in and they would say, my partner just told me that the relationship's over. Or they'd say, I just found a lump in my breast, or I just found a dark spot on my skin. And all of a sudden, there was a kind of lucidity where all of a sudden everything got really real. There was no more time in the picture, so there was no time to waste. And they started getting lucid and really, in the presence of, it's going to be a week before I can see my doctor, and another week before I can have a biopsy, and another week before I get a result. And in those 3 weeks, they'd be plunged into a deep not knowing, and time was taken out of the picture. And all of a sudden, they wanted to talk about the deepest things and look into the deepest things. And while they hadn't wanted to do counseling with their partner and had been complaining about them for maybe years, when the person said, that's it, I met someone else, I'm leaving, all of a sudden they had this lucidity about the relationship and this care to really look into things. And they were seeing all these patterns. And it's just interesting that I think the presence of the absolute has to do with taking time out of the picture. And I'm just very interested in what happens when there is no more time, when we can't harbor the illusion of having more time and how that changes things.
Mhm.
All of a sudden, in my experience, things get very real. I mean, I do Qigong every day and I meditate every day and I eat right every day because I don't know how much time I have left. But if you told me you're going to live another 150 years, all of a sudden, like, whew, okay. Do you know what I mean? It's just, that takes away some tension. And I have seen people get completely lucid. And what's interesting, they come back and the biopsy's negative, and I'll bring up, well, we were working on this. And they were like, oh yeah, I'm not really interested in that now. I said, but you said this, you said this, you said this. They go, oh, I was just saying. They like lose all the intensity. They completely become like another person as soon as it turns out the lump was benign. I've seen this happen quite a few times. So I'm interested in that dynamic tension of taking out the assumption of time and how that brings the absolute and an urgency into a picture of this is the only moment I have. It has to happen now.
Yeah, so that makes me wonder, like we got about 20 minutes left on our call. What if we knew that this was the last 20 minutes that we had? Like, what would that bring to our conversation right now? Like, if we really stepped into that, like, what would we say? And how would we orient to here? Like, basically doing what Lonnie just said. I wonder what would happen.
Yeah, I was going to pick up on that and like even intensify it and bring it to the last moment, which really isn't a moment at all. But sometimes when somebody is at the final moment of their own transcendence, the unresolvable of their life is resolved. It's not there. And there's the meeting of heaven and earth. And you can't even say it's a moment. You can't say at the moment of death. You can't say at the moment when life was over, because it kind of expands and opens up the eternal. And so it's almost like there's more life there because there's no time.
Yeah, I mean, Lorie said it twice now. What is it that that brings us to this space? And I mean, in a certain way, people have asked that for thousands of years. With all of the so-called Gnostic practices are that in a way, including this death moment that we were just talking about, right? There are all these Tibetan or other practices where you literally sit in the charnel ground and blowing the flute made out of a thigh bone and invite the ghosts to feast on you so you capture this. What's the worst thing that can happen? And how would that change my reality? And my own, and Lonnie was saying, right, you doing all the Qigong and all these things, we all, to some extent, are doing that because we want to be more, yeah, Vasanthi was saying, it's not just us, it's the patient there, of course, it totally that it's this alchemical fusion with us and the patient, but then the patient comes in and says, oh, the doctors told me I only have 1 month to live. There is an ability to somehow, regardless in what kind of a space they are from our perspective, to transform that by, for instance, just radiating love from an open heart that they can feel, or saying the right word. You know, for some people it's joking, for other people it's praying, but somehow finding the right word. And it's for that the heart needs to be open. All those practices, and I've done a lot of them, they do help. I would be an absolute misanthrope without that. However, there are just periods in life when some of it is astrological, right? I remember this 28-year-old kid telling me, you know, that years from 2004 to 2009, they'll be the best in your life, or so. I didn't understand what he meant, but it was really, it was like this ability to be heart open, not just in the treatment room, but with the world, with yourself, with your family, your friends, etc. was easy, and you were in that Tao space. And then there are other periods, even though supposedly you have more cultivation, more experience, and you can lean more, like Lorie was saying, you have that experience of going like it's all relative, you know, it's take a deep breath and it's all, I can lean into that, you know, it's there. Physically, you know that, and mentally, emotionally, you know that after all these years of having gone in and out of that space. But sometimes it's just, right, like, wasn't it Mother Teresa who said, you know, I saw the living Christ once and then I've been waiting for my whole life and never happened again.
Mm.
And that was actually, I think, one of the reasons why she was made into a saint or so, because she kept trooping on with what she was doing, despite her writing in her diaries that nothing is happening. I feel nothing. And I mean, I feel that too, that sometimes, and I don't know what that is, you know, why sometimes it's so easy and sometimes it's harder. And sometimes, yes, it's the patient and the alchemy, but technically it's that, right, that challenge to, no matter what comes at you, you're able to find the right word with the hippie child and the business person with the shiny shoes and the ties that I was always afraid of seeing at the beginning of my career. Um, Sometimes it's easy and sometimes it's not. Yeah.
It seems like it always carries the frequency of love.
Yeah. That's the heart is not a pump, as we all know. It's the love organ. It's the Tong Shenming organ, right? It's the organ that connects us to the light of the Tao and that what we call the absolute here. And just that portal is very fickle, and sometimes it's by grace. It's open you in that space, and then, but I like what Lorie said. It's at least you intellectually know at this stage of life and practice, it's always there. It's you're not truly despairing because you think like, oh, it's everything is meaningless and there's only darkness and there's this suffering and I can't do anything about it. You just know you can't break through at that particular moment in time, and that's okay too, I suppose.
I'm listening to each of you like these are your final words ever. And what it brings up for me is it's like there's such a sacredness and a loving presence that's like infusing every whether you're speaking or listening, but that there's such a sacredness. It's like being in the presence of divinity, speaking the most sacred words, regardless of the content, although there's that too.
Mhm.
It's such a gift.
Yeah, it seems to be infused with gratitude.
Mm.
Gratitude for the opportunity. I mean, to have the conversation.
Gratitude for being able to practice this incredible medicine. Just probably heal me more than my patients, if I think about it. Well, I should put it in the present tense, maybe. Is healing me? Yeah. Its boundlessness has been unfathomable to me, and the miracles.
I want to say that the question that I kept asking, like, how, okay, yeah, like we're talking, but how did, and I feel like we got it. I feel like Alexander, your invitation and Lonny kind of leading us in, it's that being, because it only can happen in this very moment. And we are in fact dying at each moment. It will never come again. So to live in that, that's that, and to practice in that. So that way it became, it's like, yes, we're present to the suffering and we're present to that this could be the very last moment, each moment.
The Bodhisattva vow tells us, may no interaction be insignificant.
That's it.
I experience a kind of a particular flavor of courage. Like, this is it. And it's not a courage of the will, like an individual will, but it's like a falling away of all of the conventions that I might sort of orient to and like check into to sort of curate how I use language. And we have a whole history of sort of orthodoxy of how things are supposed to be, and there's a way that all falls to the wayside in the presence of this sort of fierce light that It's just right here.
And the aspect of time that's floated around, the atemporality of this space, that that sort of eruption of the absolute in the relative is atemporal, out of time, and that it can only be now, right now. And I hear you about the courage, because it's kind of terrifying, right? To sit here together like this, wonderfully terrifying.
Well, it's exhilarating.
Yeah, and also, like, I just feel like I love you all so much. But I'm like, I adore you. I wish we could just all hug each other now.
But there's something, courage is one word. There's a nobility to striving to articulate that which can't really be articulated, but not letting that daunt us, but striving. I get a sense of like the tendrils pushing into the future to sense imminent possibility just beyond comprehension. And that striving to articulate the absolute here in the relative world, I mean, it can never succeed, but in the striving to do it, there is something created that is luminous and has these different virtues we've named.
Yeah, it's like it creates a portal into this unknown multidimensionality where something pours in that we're feeling, and it's very difficult to articulate, but it's almost more real than the relative. When it gets so strong that you can just kind of bathe in it, bask in it, and then the relative is kind of out here.
Sky wakes up.
I mean, that's what I endeavor to put a needle into.
Right.
Well, have we done it? Anyone have anything else to say?
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Things feel very luminous. Beautiful to see you all.
Really good. Yes, this is our last one of this year.
Have a beautiful, healthy new year, everyone.
Yes. We'll
Thank
reconvene on the other
well.
side. So much love to you all.
And to all our listeners.
May there be luminous solstices.
Okay, I'm going to stop recording.